So welcome to One Slide, One Lesson from the Biomechanics Academy. This is going to be a sequence of lessons on various aspects of musculoskeletal medicine and biomechanics of the whole kinetic chain. And we're going to start with the pelvis, which is my favourite area of biomechanics and my PhD research area that I'm currently doing. And we're going to keep it simple to start off with just by talking about the general principles of movement at the pelvis and also the joints of the pelvis. So even though you look at the pelvis and think it's quite a simple structure, with each wing of the pelvis and the sacrum with the vertebrae sitting on top and the hip joints, it's quite a complex structure and it's absolutely vital for normal function. So you sometimes talk to old orthopedic practitioners that say that the pelvis doesn't move and the sacroiliac joint has very little movement. Well, that can't be further from the truth. The pelvis has a huge variety of movement, and that's because there's 8 axis points that I'm going to talk about. And in the next slide we'll go into a little bit more detail. But even though there's a little bit of movement and translation at the sacroiliac joint, for example, when you couple that with the hip joint range of movement, it allows us as bipeds and ambulant human beings to do a huge variety of activities. And it's no wonder that when you get dysfunction in the pelvis, it can create issues further around the kinetic chain. So you could have, for example, a sacroiliac joint that's locked up and restricted, and that will completely throw out the whole gait cycle. So during this sequence of talks and lessons, I'm going to talk about how to recognize dysfunction that comes from the pelvis and affects areas as distant away as the big toe, or occipitofrontalis at the back of the head, or the rhomboids, or when one arm doesn't move, and all that can come from pelvic dysfunction. And there's a massive variety of pathomechanical movements and function and injury that can come from a dysfunctional pelvis. So where the sacrum wedges in between those two inanimate bones to form this self-bracing mechanism, there's a joint on either side called the sacroiliac joint, and they're partially synovial and partially fibrous. So the synovial part is the diarthrosis, and although we don't know exactly where the axis point, it's somewhere in that area. The fibrous part of it, it's a really unusual joint because it's rarely that you get a joint that's partly synovial and partly fibrous. But the fibrous part can be as different as our faces are. There's lots of little nodules and osteophytes that kind of brace it together, which is why, if you jumped off a high object and landed on one leg, you'd have severe pain because there will be like an upshift within that joint which would need treatment. But as we age, that fibrous part of the sacroiliac joint starts to reduce its movement and it slowly starts to fuse. It fuses in women first, and it's under the influence of physiological changes, say for example during menopause. I know my own sacroiliac joints have started to reduce their movement purely by impact because I've been running for 50 years, and probably much of that time back in the day when I was an athlete would have been on the road. But that diarthrosis, the synovial part of the sacroiliac joint, although we don't know exactly where the axis point is, that's where most of the movement is. And it's actually ear-shaped. It's called an auricular surface because it's Latin for ear. The other major joint complex, and the 3 major joints, we talked about one, the sacroiliac joints, but the other one is the lumbo-sacral complex, where the lumbar spine sits on that sacral base. That sacral base is also called the sacral promontory. And between the 5th lumbar vertebrae and the top of the sacrum is a fibrocartilaginous pad. That spongy disc, and often people have disc issues if there's abnormal position and rotation or trauma or a disease process, or sometimes a cancer of the disc. You can have all kinds of issues. That disc is an amphiarthrosis, and that means limited movement. Just behind that lumbosacral complex are 2 facet joints, and that's these here, these facet joints, and they articulate with the little spinous processes on either side of the 5th lumbar vertebrae. And in footballers that tend to have quite, well, not just footballers, but young sports people, certainly if they're very good athletes, they tend to have more of an anterior pelvis than, say, someone that sits all day and they've got a counter-nutated sacrum. But the more anterior the pelvis, the more you'll get pressure on the facet joints. And on occasions, certainly in lateral sports like football, where there's trauma as well, you can fracture those little facet joints and you'll get a pars fracture. And those small facet joints have got a strange name. They're zygapophyseal joints. Try saying that when you've had a few drinks. So the third major joint of the pelvis is the pubic symphysis. And that's this joint here that joins each wing. This is the lower part of the pelvis. You can't see the fibrocartilaginous pad because this is just a model and there isn't one there. But that's the joint that softens during the gestation period so that it opens slightly during childbirth. You can get an injury there actually. Certainly if there's a big difference in leg length, or you're in a sport where there's lots of asymmetric pressure, and you can get an injury called osteitis pubis, where the pubic symphysis splits. There's very poor blood supply there, so it can be an injury that can take a long time to heal. And what you do with that is look for pelvic asymmetry and look for that leg length and raise it and bring those pubic symphyses back together, so over a long period of time it can heal again. Very frustrating injury, and you'll see it very rarely. I've probably treated half a dozen over about 30 years. And it's vitally important that each one of those joint complexes is in the right position in all three planes and functions well. If any one of those joint complexes is dysfunctional, it won't only affect the pelvis, but you'll have symptoms that spread away from the pelvis because the passenger unit sits on the sacral promontory and the legs articulate from it. So the arm movement and the movement of the sacrum and that reciprocal cyclic movement of the legs are all tied together. So I'm going to leave it there for the pelvis. We're going to do other slides on the pelvis because I think this is a really important area that practitioners need to know more about. So I'm going to do a sequence of these one slide, one lessons on the pelvis so we can expand the biomechanical knowledge of the pelvis. So don't forget to subscribe to our Facebook page, our Instagram page and our YouTube page, all under Biomechanics Academy, and I'll see you on the next lesson.